and is quite the expert. So we're so pleased to have him. A couple of short announcements. We'll be sending out his slides and some other pieces that you can refer to right after the training, along with an evaluation of the training. So please, if you could complete the evaluation online, and we always look at those very closely. The next researcher training, led by Dr. Vic Babarda, is going to be on career resilience, which I think we can all benefit from. That will be June 17th via Zoom, starting at 9 o'clock. It'll be from 9 to 10. And then one other important announcement is that our seed grant, annual seed grant announcement, just went out. So if you have not received that, let us know, but hopefully many of you can pass that along to those who might be interested in applying. So,
okay, is that it?
That's it.
All right. Good morning, everyone. There are a number of names that I recognize in this list, and several of you that I know personally, Corey and Christine. I feel like Christine's already kind of heard this part of this presentation before, but it's nice to have you on. I have the chat window open on my other screen over here, so if you want to ask questions, I'll try to keep glancing at it and answer those, and then if we want more discussion, you can come off mute and do it that way. I also have it up over here on my my laptop, just so that I can see if the screen share is going to be working. So I've given this lecture a number of times. I really do appreciate the evaluations, and I want to make the information valuable to you. Much of what we'll talk about, you'll know in little bits and pieces, and hopefully there'll be some nuggets that you can walk away with that might help as you manage your projects moving forward. So let me try to get my PowerPoint here going. I'm just going to share my screen, and okay. Let's get to the beginning of this, though. Let's see what happens here. Hold on, technical problems. Let's see, start this over from the beginning. There we go. Okay. All right. So what I want to do is give you an idea today of I want to be able to see you guys here. Some requirements of the PI, just some little nuggets, little tidbits here and there that you can try to pay attention to in managing your grants. And in some of the prior evaluation feedbacks, some of the scholars have wanted a little bit more information on what to think about when actually developing a budget. And so I've made up just a skeleton budget for a made up tiny little clinical trial. I know that Corey's got a lot of experience in this area, so he may be actually able to provide some input as we walk through it. But I just thought I would walk through a budget later on, and then also how to create a simple tracking budget, what to think about in drafting a budget justification, and then also I've downloaded a financial detail report from a pilot project that the CCTSI funded a couple of years ago, just to point out what they look like, what kinds of things to look for if you're ever presented with one. I'm hoping that most of you have access to some administrative help within your sections, units, divisions that could help you with making sense of the financial reports and translating that to some of your tracking information. So let's get started and move through this. I want to see how to get to the chat window when I'm sharing. go. Huh, I don't see it showing that. All right, well, if you have a question, take yourself off mute and interrupt me. Okay, so to start out, kind of just some very obvious bullet points about the PI responsibilities. The buck stops with you. You really are responsible, and there's really not going to be anybody that's going to bail you out if things go poorly. You're responsible for the oversight of all the financial management. You're responsible for ensuring that you spend your grant money the way that you told your funder you were going to spend the grant money, and that you understand at least a little bit about what your flexibility is in case things don't go exactly how you planned. Remember, you're writing this project and you're developing this grant budget, 12 months or so before you actually get the award. So things can change. And most grants allow you to have the ability to move funds between categories within certain parameters without actually having to ask for permission. But you're ultimately, if you end up doing something that you're not supposed to, you're the one that's going to be responsible. And I'll mention it several times throughout this talk. Keeping good documentation is really the key. We're lucky, most of the things are electronic these days. So the purchases that you're assigning to your grant, you can usually pop back into Concur and look at a procurement card report that would have uploaded receipts and documentation. You can get that documentation out of Marketplace. So I think that things have improved in that regard. But it's important if you're doing things that are on the fringe, and I don't mean that kind of in a negligent way or anything, but if you're doing something that seems like somebody that doesn't know anything about your project might look at it and say, ooh, kind of explain that to me, then that's where you want to take a little bit more time to maybe just add a couple of comments that you can electronically append a note to a procurement card report, or write a note in a Word document and attach it and get it uploaded to the Marketplace documentation, or just keep a little log for yourself in case somebody comes asking you a later date. This I find really interesting. You can read it as I'm talking. This is straight out of the grants policy statement is what it's called for the Department of Health and Human Safety. And it talks about the responsibility of the PI. And as you read through this, you should be picking out things like, you're the designated person with the authority and responsibility to oversee the project, ensuring compliance with financial administrative aspects of the work of the award, work closely with other administrative officials within the organization to maintain necessary documents, blah, 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 blah. You get to the very bottom that I've highlighted, and that's the first place it actually talks about the fact that this is a scientific project. And oh, by the way, maybe you should keep in contact with your program officer about the aspects of the science. And so, once you've decided to apply for a grant and accept funding, you're no longer just a scientist. You're now partially an administrator with responsibilities that can have very serious ramifications. I just have always, I show that, and I always just find it pretty amazing that that their definition doesn't talk much about your qualifications and qualities as a scientist and those responsibilities. I like to show kind of what I call the anatomy of a grant award. This is a grant award from NIH that you're looking at. Foundation award letters look different. Other federal agencies award letters look different. I'm mostly familiar with NIH award letters. And I'll just point out a few things. So, at the top, it'll remind you what institute you actually applied for. And a really important piece of information is your grant number here, because any communication that you'll be having with your grants management specialist or program officer, you'll need to cite or reference the grant number. And to break down an NIH grant number, this numbers can be a 1 or a 3 or a 5, and it depends. It tells NIH at what level or what stage in your award you are at. So I think they call this a type 5, which is the second year of a 5-year award. And so the first letters are the kind of the grant mechanism that you're being funded with. The second 2 letters are the 2-letter abbreviation of the institute. TR is for NCATS. And then you've got your 6-digit grant number, and the last 2 numbers are always the kind of the year of the award segment that you're in. So if you ever wondered how that breaks down, this particular notice of grant award that I'm showing you says revised, and I'll show you in a later page here why that is. And then they provide a date for when these notice of grant awards are sent out. People refer to them as NGAs or even NOGAs, notice of grant award, NOGA. You've got the designation of what specific budget period you're in, what the dates are, and then what's the entire project period. Most people get their grant award and they want to jump right to the budget page and see how much money did we get. And I want to try to drive home the point that, yeah, go ahead and do that and look and be excited, but then back up and carefully read this document, because there's things in it that tell you about your grant. So they'll specify for this particular award period or budget period what's the breakdown in your funds. And this is our main CTSA grant, and it's a lot of money. When we first started the CTSA, this total cost amount down here was $13 million. So we've gradually taken some cuts as the program has morphed and changed throughout the years from when we were first funded in 2008. Not much more on that page to point out. As you progress past the budget pages, there's some standard policy terms that you can just kind of breeze through. I like to make sure that I pay attention to when the section starts special terms and conditions, because this is where they start telling you specifically about your award, what you may or may not be allowed to do. What I'm pointing out here is this is why this particular NOGA is revised. We had 2 of our directors that retired last year, and they were listed as key personnel in the notice of grant award. So we're required to actually send information to NIH, notifying them that in this case, Dr. Hay and Dr. Khan had retired and were leaving their positions at the CCTSI, and that we were proposing the individuals to replace them. And Tellen Bennett replaced Michael Kahn as the informatics core director, and Terry Hernandez replaced Bill Hay as the director of our kind of child health research program. And so then also on your grants, the thing to pay attention to is who's specifically listed. It always says in addition to the PI, and then it'll list some names that you've kind of designated in your original application as being a key person, a key contributor to your project. You have specific obligations with those key persons. You can read this sentence right here. They can't be absent from the project for more than 3 months without you communicating with NIH. And if they need to change their effort on the project by more than 25% of what you expected to fund them, either up or down, you have to notify NIH and get permission to do that. So, so there's those kinds of rules for the CTSA program. We have this specific rule that we're not allowed to provide any of our grant funds in support of any clinical activity beyond phase 2B. There's probably 6 pages of these special terms and conditions for our CTSA award. My point being that you should take the time to read them and try to understand them. And if you need some help, ask a colleague, ask an administrator in your section or division, or your award is assigned to grants and contracts post-award specialist as well, that you can always reach out to and say, hey, I noticed that this was listed in my grant and I don't know what it means. So this is the last page of a typical NIH award, and it specifically tells you who's your contact people at the institute that's managing your specific award. So our program official is Pablo CRA, and this is listed as Shannon Oden, and our grants management special changed this year to a guy named David Madu. So the notice of grant award that we just got in May for year 3 has David's name there. And then they outline what they're expecting to fund your project at for for the future years. So you can take a look at how that'll break down, whether you have a declining budget that they're that they've awarded to you, what your F&A rate is, just information to have. Does anybody have any questions on that? If not, I'll just plow ahead. So I wanted to say a little bit about key persons. There's two definitions of key persons that you'll kind of have to understand. One is the NIH definition, which is what we all think of key persons, in my opinion, and that's who's the folks that are providing key contributions to your project. That if their contributions to your project were to change or go away, would have an impact on probably the ability of you to complete what you had said that you were going to do. And so these are folks that are making key contributions to the development and execution of the project, and they typically have advanced terminal degrees. You note here that folks with master's degrees and baccalaureate BS degrees are probably not key personnel, but they can be. For instance, my name's not on this award somehow as a key person. I've got a master's degree and an MBA, and I'm usually listed on this award because it's such a large award with such a broad impact on campus, and a lot of money. And I've got years of experience in managing large grants like this that we've put me as a key personnel. And when they issued that last notice of award, my name disappeared, which is fine by me because that now I'm released from that flexibility of changing my effort to the grant by more or less than 25%. We've got substantial institutional support to the CCTSI as well. So we're constantly moving salaries on and off the grant to help kind of balance the spending throughout the year. And that just makes it a lot easier now that I'm not actually formally listed as a key person. The second definition is our local definition. And it basically, grants and contracts basically considers everybody a key person. And so what that means is when you're completing your grant application, these folks here have to complete the financial conflict of interest report, which we're going to talk about next. So I just wanted to point out the differences between the local interpretation of a key person and the grant federal interpretation, because you'll hear that and maybe wonder why the difference. So there's a host of required kind of reportings that you need to manage as PI on a research grant. And so, one of them is the financial conflict of interest, which I know you all are familiar with. What you need to pay attention to is kind of linked to what I just said about the local definition of a key person. If you've got study coordinators, technicians in the lab, statistician, whatever, listed on your grant, when you go to route that grant to grants and contracts, there's a person in grants and contracts that's going to confirm that everybody on that grant has completed the financial conflict of interest disclosure. And they won't process it through until everybody's done so. And so on a number of occasions, I've been scrambling to try to get, a half a dozen people to complete the conflict of interest so that grants and contracts will push the CCTSI routing to the next stage. So just be aware of that. And you can always just wait until you route it and see if they pick anybody that hasn't completed it. I even think there might be a little checkbox in the personnel tab of the routing form that is an indication of whether or not the person has completed their disclosure. So you could probably see that at the time that you're completing it. Or you can always just send the grants and contracts a list of the folks that are on your grant to say, hey, do I need to worry about any of these folks completing their conflict of interest while I'm working to route my grant? Effort reporting, I'm sure that you guys all see this. There's 3 effort reporting periods. I believe they're, I think September through December, January through May, and June through August, I think are those dates. But anyways, you get a notification and you're supposed to certify how your salary, how your pay has been distributed to various projects or institutional funds. And so that form is broken down in 2 parts. The upper part itemizes the grant projects, the sponsored projects that you've had your salary distributed to, and it'll list what % of your salary was put onto each project, and then below the line is everything else. And those forms are confusing to most people. They're confusing to me, and I look at them regularly. Oftentimes they're not correct. I would just want to say two things. One is take the report seriously, because it is a legal document. Once you certify it, you're certifying that, yep, this is correct. This is how my pay was distributed, and I provided that amount of effort to those projects. I believe that grants and contracts allows a 3 or 4% error rate up or down on what they list as the effort that's been dedicated to each of those projects. If you see something that you either don't recognize the project or the effort looks way wrong, then you need to just start asking some questions of the folks that administratively support you, so that you understand really why that effort was distributed in that way. It could be totally legit, it could be an error. You want to make sure that it's not fraud by somebody applying effort to a project because they've got money to spend and you need salary support, but you're not providing any effort to that project. So it's a legal document. It's serious. You'll see at the end of this talk that auditors look at this when they come in the door. They're looking at EPR statements. I would caution you to talk to your administrator first to understand that everything's correct, because if you just change the percentages on that right-hand column where it says where you just start plugging in the percentages, it has to add up to 100. Once you submit that, if the differences are greater than that 3 or 4%, the payroll system starts to do these automatic payroll transfers. It initiates them behind the scenes, and if they get approved, then it moves money from one project to another project. And if the EPR was correct to begin with, then that's just a pain in the butt for us administrators to have to try to go back and clean up. So we'd much rather answer questions on the front end than try to clean it up on the back end. I think you all are familiar with the NIH Public Access policy, which is to cite your grants on your publications. And the things that I've learned about this are that I think when you're filling out your manuscript submission paperwork and you cite or you indicate that this manuscript was supported by this particular grant, most of the publication houses will go ahead and handle the submission to the NIH manuscript website that starts the process. It's important to understand that there are some interactions that the corresponding author on the publication has to do within the NIH manuscript system in order for the publication to move to the next step, which is to be submitted to the PubMed Central database and get it's called a PMCID, I think, a PubMed Central ID number, which is what tells tells them the application system or the reporting system that NIH uses that this is a compliant publication. It is compliant with the NIH Public Access policy. I say that because for the CCTSI, as you guys know, we, Christine and Corey specifically, if you've received funding for the CCTSI, if you've used resources like the CTRC, we ask you to cite the CCTSI grant on your publication. And so we get hundreds and hundreds of publications that cite the CCTSI grant every year, and we're not the corresponding author on those grants. And when we go to do our annual report, we're required to report all these publications. Any publication that has cited our grant automatically gets pulled into that progress reporting system. And if it's non-compliant, then we have to go tracking down the PI or the corresponding author of that publication and help them through those steps of getting that manuscript to march through the system. The likelihood that that would happen to you guys is low, but it could happen to you with your own publications. So you've cited your publication, you missed the communication about the NIH manuscript approval step, and you go to do your annual progress report, and the publications that get pulled in are showing as non-compliant, and you'll have to figure out how to kind of march through the process to get those approved so that they'll convert over to compliant status before your next award is funded. ClinicalTrials.gov. Most of you are probably doing human research. I'm not totally familiar with the intricacies of the requirements for this. From a broad perspective, I think if you're doing human research, you've got to register your trial at least register your trial in clinicaltrials.gov. If you're doing a defined clinical trial that COMERB has specified as an applicable clinical trial, then there's much more rigorous registration and reporting requirements into clinicaltrials.gov. It's your responsibility as the PI to manage that. And from my perspective, this comes up every now and then. It has come up with some of the KL2, CCTSI KL2 scholars that we fund, where they have a clinical research project, and our program officer has asked me on a number of occasions to provide the NCT number, the clinicaltrials.gov number, applicable to that study. And in a few rare occasions, it's not been there, so it's not been done. And so then we have to scramble and go back and say, hey, you know what, you had to actually register your trial on here. So make sure that you're familiar with the rules and regulations around this, and if whatever you're doing requires you just to simply register your study, or if it's deemed applicable, which the IRB makes that determination, so it'll be in your IRB letter of approval if you have a more rigorous interaction with clinicaltrials.gov. Then the last bullet on this particular required reporting is this research project progress report, which is the annual progress report. I'm sure that you guys have had the opportunity to do this through your ERA Commons account, and you'll fill this out. If it's a requirement for you, it will be specified in the terms and conditions of your notice of grant award. They're due 60 days before the beginning of the next budget period, and you're required to go through and provide progress information, list the people that worked on the grant, how much calendar months did they provide, blah, blah, blah. But it is a requirement, and if it's not submitted timely or not submitted at all, they won't issue the next year of your grant segment. Required trainings for you as a PI. I bet you most of you have had to do the RCR, the 12 courses or whatever it is. I believe that that's a requirement that has to be repeated every 3 years, and if you're a mentor, once every 7 years or something like that. But that's offered through the regulatory office, and the CCTSI sponsors that and provides content for a number of those courses. You're all familiar, I know, with the city courses, the human subjects research training, and NIH will ask for confirmation that you've completed that if they're funding a project that involves human subjects. So you need to make sure you stay current on that. I know that COMERB requires that as well. For those of you that do animal research, you're familiar with the IACUC, the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, and the process of submitting a protocol like an IRB protocol for the committee to review and approve. I believe that these animal studies are typically approved for 3 years instead of typically 1 for human subjects. And I don't know if this last bullet is accurate anymore. I'd be interested if any of you actually know or not. There used to be a requirement from grants and contracts that if you were a new PI, so that you'd never submitted an application before, that there were several courses that like Skillsoft courses that they wanted you to take. They kind of generally outline your responsibilities as a PI, much of the stuff that we're talking about today. So I just throw that out there to say that, that watch out for that. At least investigate to see if there's, if you're a new PI, this is the first time you're submitting an independent application, if there's any training through grants and contracts that you might have to take. Amy Gannon, who is the director of grants and contracts and also the associate vice chancellor over finance these days, has asked me to start including a brief discussion about subrecipient monitoring, because it's something that auditors are taking a closer look at across the country. And so a subrecipient is a person that you subcontract with. So for instance, the CCTSI subcontracts with National Jewish, University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado State, Denver Health, Kaiser Permanente. So we've got 5 approved subcontracts on our overall main grant, and my office and Dr. Sokol have some responsibilities to make sure that we understand how they're spending their money. So you should generally be reviewing the expenses that are getting approved if you have a subcontract on your grant. My recommendation is that you should set up some regular communication with with the PI at the subrecipient institution. You should be doing that anyways to be addressing the kind of the progress of your science, but some of that should also involve a quick discussion about the budget. How's the budget going? Are we supporting personnel? Are those personnel actually, working at the level that you've agreed to fund? If you're paying 40% of a lab tech or a coordinator, are they providing that effort? Some of the things that can happen with a subrecipient is that your contract gets issued on a given date, but then it takes several months for you and that other scientific colleague to get your projects up and going. Well, that PI might have some salary support on this project, and there might be a coordinator, a lab tech, or something like that. But if they're invoicing for effort, let's just say it started in May, if they're invoicing for effort in May and June, and you specifically know that no effort in May and June has been provided, then you ought to, talk about the elephant in the room and say, hey, you guys have been invoicing for salary support, and there's nothing being done on this grant, because you as the PI are responsible once you technically approve that invoice. So I would try to understand the process flow within your own administrative unit to say, how are those invoices being submitted for payment? Are they going directly to grants and contracts? If they do, they should be getting routed to you as the PI to sign off on before they get processed for payment. If they're going directly to your administrative offices, then you should make sure to tell those folks, hey, I need to see the invoices that are coming over from CSU on this project. And you don't have to use a fine-tooth comb and go through there, but you should just kind of occasionally take a look at them and understand that the project is going the way that you kind of have expected it to go, and that you have been in contact with your scientific colleague at the other institution that's directing that. And I think it would be wise to document a quick note about that discussion, both on the scientific aspects and a quick sentence or two about the budget discussion, and just tuck that away in your binder, and you've covered your ass now if somebody comes looking down the road at a later date. They have 60 days to submit their final invoice before it's closed out at the end of your budget period. That's communicated in the contract itself, but sometimes they're really slow, and it irritates everybody when you get an invoice that comes in after 60 days and people have already done the administrative work to close down that subcontract for that budget period. So it's just something to be aware of. So quick comments about audits. I don't know how many of you have been around a long time here, but probably 10 years ago now, the Office of the Inspector General came to the university and audited the university. So that's the highest auditing body in the country. And that audit lasted a long time, more than a year. And then I know that the discussions between our institution and the OIG went on for several years after that, back and forth to negotiate and justify some of the findings that were found for the university, which I don't know what those findings were, but there were some and they were substantial. This is a comment that actually Janine Higgins gave me this, that she found at another institution. And I think that what I really want to point out is that they audited this many transactions. Here's the total amount of findings that they reported in their finding report. And the vast majority of them were related to the fact that the costs were not adequately documented. I would venture that probably the vast majority of these would be allowable expenses if they were appropriately documented. So that's just keep that in the back of your mind as you're doing things. We'll talk about that a little bit more. We're going to talk about this concept of reasonableness here, and so some of that was denied because because the auditor felt like that particular cost was not reasonable, and I've got a slide that talks about that. And then there's this policy, there's this concept of consistency. Costs need to be treated consistently under the institution's policy. They can't allow certain costs to be allowed in one situation and have a policy that says that those costs aren't allowed in another situation. So briefly, what's an auditor looking for? They're going to look and see, what did you say in your FAQ? And so you're going to have to be able to document that you're doing what you said you would do. How do they look at this stuff? They look at those EPRs. So an auditor will be wanting to check that EPR and make sure that it looks good, and they can do some kind of financial forensics to track stuff down. I've not heard of an auditor going back and wanting to say, look at lab notebooks and stuff like that to find specific documentation that appropriate effort was provided. I believe that for somebody to go to that level, there would have to be some real evidence of fraud involved for them to do that. But they do look at that, and they'll ask questions about it. They want to see in the notice of award, were there any special terms and conditions that that said you can't do this? And if you did that, then you're going to have a problem. When the OIG was here, they looked at student timesheets in my unit. We had several students that were working for us, and they wanted to make sure that the student had signed the timesheet and that the supervisor had signed the timesheet. And so, we had to dig back several years of timesheets and make sure that everything was in order. And they'll clearly go through the financial statements and start looking for typical expenses that they would expect not to see on the type of research grant that you're managing. They'll look at allowability as the expense restricted by the award policy in the notice of grant award. I've got a slide that talks about allocability and reasonableness. So that's just down the road here. So what can you do to protect yourself? Again, understand what you're allowed to and not allowed to do by policy for your award. Understand the typical types of expenses that are allowable versus unallowable, and I've got a slide on that in a minute. This used to be, and this is one of those trainings that I was referencing. OGC had a training that basically went through what are allowable direct charging to sponsored projects, and I thought it was pretty helpful because it kind of outlined generally what you would expect to be able to charge and not be able to charge. For instance, most of the grants that you guys will have, one wouldn't allow you to support an administrative person on that grant. It's supposed to be covered by the institution's overhead. And it's difficult because you might have an admin assistant or a program coordinator in a department or a unit that supports, half a dozen or more investigators. How do you define how much of that person's effort goes on to each project, and how do you track that? And so those are put into the overhead pools, and most grants don't allow that. Our grant is an infrastructure grant that's mostly administration, and so most of our salaries are actually administrative salaries on the grant, and that's allowable under our program. But there's some other expense categories that I'll talk about in a second. And the other thing is, don't be afraid to get to know your post-award specialist at grants and contracts. If you've got a question about whether an expense can be charged to the grant or not, then shoot a note to that person and ask. The grants management specialist at NIH that's assigned to your grant typically doesn't want to communicate regularly with you. They prefer that those communications go through grants and contracts. So, if you guys had some question that needed to go up to the grants office to get clarified, you should draft that up in an email or a letter, consult with your post-award specialist, and then that person will submit that to your program officer and grants management specialist for a formal response. NIH will never provide a formal response that doesn't come back through grants and contracts. Document your decisions and approvals where it makes sense. The retention policy is 3 years past the end of the last grant period in your budget. So if you've got a 5-year grant, you're supposed to keep documents for 3 years past that. So you conceivably keeping documents for 8 years on a 5-year grant before you can technically destroy those. When the OIG was on campus, the leadership was very clear to say, just answer the question. Don't provide any additional information that's going to get you in trouble. If they have a specific question, respond with a specific response. So that's always good advice. Your lawyer would probably tell you that too. And here's one that I put in because it affects administrators. If you leave the institution, make sure that your records are in good shape, and make sure that the administrators in your particular unit know where your documentation is kept or stored, because we're the ones that have to go digging for information if an auditor shows up and asks for that stuff and you're no longer around. And then we're trying to probably track you down at your new institution to say, hey, we're being asked to provide the following documentation. Some basic cost principles. Direct charges to your grant must clearly support the scope of work and be reasonable and allocable. I've got a slide on that. And here's some general costs to be careful with on a general research or training type grant. Food is a sensitive expense. If you're going to charge food to your grant, you better be sure that you address that in the budget justification when you submitted it. For instance, maybe you're doing some focus groups that are several-hour focus groups, and you want to be able to provide some coffee and tea and soda and some cookies or whatever. That's totally reasonable, right? And as long as you outline it in your grant, and your grant was awarded with no comments about that, then you can charge that. For the CCTSI, we do a ton of that. Many of you are involved in some of the trainee sessions, or you go to a town hall or something like that, and we'll provide food. But I have a food line item in the grant, and we talk about it, and we actually have a policy that's approved by the Vice Chancellor for Research to provide food for these events, so that when I'm submitting procurement card reports with food, we always attach that little policy so that somebody's not asking questions. General office supplies, general administrative assistance are should typically be provided under F&A, so they should be available as part of your section and division. You can always get away with buying, a case of paper, sticky notes, pens and pencils, highlighters, things that you would generally need to use to, print out your data, analyze your data, work with your data. That you're not going to get your hand slapped for that. But you shouldn't be paying for the copier rental for your unit. You shouldn't be paying for your office phone, things like that. Certainly no internet charges. Cell phones and computers have become relaxed in more recent policy guidance issues. I still tell people the prudent thing to do, if you need a cell phone, you better have a good justification why you have to have a cell phone and pay for it on your grant. Maybe you're the study doc that needs to be available 24/7. It's prudent that you pay for that cell phone with part of your grant funds and with part of your own funds, so that if an auditor comes poking around, you've acknowledged that. Unless this is your practice, that you're going to carry around two phones, and one of them, the red hotline phone for your study, and used for nothing but that, then I wouldn't pay for that cell phone 100% on your grant. Same concept for computers. It's very logical to request a computer when you're getting a large grant. You're going to use it to analyze data, do research, blah, 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 but you're also going to use it for your general web browsing, your email account that you're communicating with all of your colleagues about and unrelated to your grant project. I always tell people, pay for 75% of it on the grant. It's totally reasonable, and pay 25% with an unrestricted fund that you have available to you. And then by that way, you're acknowledging that, I thought about this in advance. This computer is not 100% for this funded project. That'll keep you out of trouble if somebody asks questions down the road. Oops, I got a little typo there. Facilities and administrative fees. In one of the prior evaluation comments, somebody asked if I'd spend a little more time on F&A. So I've got a slide on that. So here, let's talk about this concept of reasonableness. And so this is the kind of the definition. I copied it out. A cost is reasonable if it does not exceed that which would be incurred by a prudent person under the circumstances prevailing at the time. and some other comments. And so there's some sub bullets here. And it's, whether the cost would be generally recognized as ordinary for the project, it's comparable to market prices, it's whether the individual acted with good prudence, and here it is again, whether or not it deviated from the regular policies for the institution. So I don't know if any of you remember the news from like the 80s when all of these government contractors were getting audited, and it's the $1,000 hammer that was charged to a federal project, or the toilet seats were a big one, $1,000 toilet seats or something. So they completely violated every bullet point here in terms of is that reasonable? So in most cases that won't affect you. I think the concept that you should be thinking about is, can I get away with a Ford, or do I need a Cadillac or a Ferrari? Depending upon the nature of your research, you may have to buy a very high-end laptop computer, maybe $8,000–$10,000. If I was me, I would want to document that, and I would want to clearly explain why that level of technology was required to support the project. Otherwise, if you just buying, the regular run-of-the-mill, supply or asset or whatever, then you're being reasonable. And then this concept of allocability is the second main one. A cost is allocable if the goods or services are chargeable and assignable to the federal award in accordance with the relative benefits received. So then they've got some subpoints here. If the cost is incurred specifically for that federal award, is necessary to complete that award. And the third one is really kind of the clincher. If the cost benefits the federal award and can be distributed in proportions that may be approximated using reasonable methods. And so, clearly if you're buying something and you're going to use 100% of it for this project, you don't have to worry about this. It's allocable. It's definitely allocable to this project. But if you got to buy something that you're going to share over multiple projects, then you should have some kind of a way to make sure that you've got an allocation process so that the grant is fairly charged. So you could take $100 supply or whatever and expense 25 to this grant, 50 to that grant, 25 to this grant. If you can kind of convince yourself that that's approximately how much of that expense is going to that project. When I worked at a biotech company, we applied for tons of these SBIR grants. And so it would be common for us to have 10 SBIR grants funding our small laboratory, many of them kind of having overlapping supply and reagent categories. And so I developed a process where I would just rotate purchases and assign them in a rotating fashion to each of the active projects. I'm talking about things like gloves that are going to be shared across the laboratory but are essential for the project, general laboratory solutions and reagents and things like that. So that was an acceptable policy. I just documented it, and then that's how we followed it. So that's kind of what this is getting at. So just keep that in the back of your mind if you run into those situations. Okay, here's our discussion on F&A. So for those of you that don't understand what F&A is, it's what the university is allowed to charge a federal project for the cost of making all of the facilities and infrastructure available to support that research. So here's some examples. Building maintenance costs for laboratories and classrooms, utilities to heat and light those spaces, the vivarium, COMERB operations, IACUC operations would fall into this. The whole infrastructure around finance and procurement and the grants and contracts office. And a big one that I left out is depreciation on buildings, on research buildings. It's a huge overhead expense that goes into this F&A calculation. The feds typically issue an F&A rate for 3 years and you renegotiate. We've been under this same 55.5% negotiation for way more than 3 years. And so I don't know what the holdup is, but Amy Gannon's office is working with folks to submit. I think we're in the process of submitting for the next negotiated rate. Your administrators may have been rotating through your spaces over the last 6 months, there's a program the university uses called Web Space that accurately documents the square footage of a space and how it's used. And so us administrators have to go and enter all of that data into that system. But what it does is it spits out a very accurate documentation of how the university's space is utilized. So if there's any training going on in that space, that space can be added to the F&A calculation. If there's research going on in that space can be added to the regular allocation. And all of that, the space adds up to the biggest piece of the pie. So the university pays critical attention to this. This is a very important line item of revenue for the institution. And technically, F&A is charged to your grant, and I'll show you on this this report that I'll show you a sample report. Technically, F&A is charged to your grant every time you make an expense. Whenever salary is charged, you'll see an F&A entry. Whenever you place an order through Marketplace for lab supply, you'll see an F&A entry associated with that, unless that charge is exempted for some reason. And there's some categories here that are exempted. Equipment that's more than $5,000 is classified as equipment, and that's exempt from any F&A charges. Certain patient care expenses are exempt. If they're coming from the hospitals, you can treat those as exempt. So those hospitals, those hospital invoices that you get, Corey, that I approve all the time, hopefully somebody in your unit is expensing those to what's called outpatient charges or inpatient charges. There's those specific expense accounts in the expense system that are tied to exempt. So when a charge goes through the finance system under outpatient charge, your grant will not get charged F&A for those charges. That's different than the invoices that you would get from, say, the CTRC core lab. Those expenses are not exempt. Let me see. Let me see if I can get this chat up on this side. I see it now over here. I'll go back here and try to answer some of these. Let's see if there's any specific to F&A. So Melanie Green. So if we have no space because we're at Children's, why don't we get credit for these spaces for F&A? There's no your space at Children's isn't included in the university's F&A rate. And I think what you're probably trying to imply is if that's your space, why do you have to pay F&A on it? There's just no way to break that. There's no way to break that out. And I believe that in the context of this negotiation, there's an accounting somehow for that, for faculty that where their space is at a different unit. But I believe that most of that space in the admin pavilion at Children's Hospital might be included as considered university space in the F&A negotiation. For instance, the CCTSI rents the 3rd floor of Leprino. It's a hospital building, but because the rent is paid centrally by the university and the activities within it as university research, it's considered on-campus space, and we pay the full 55.5%, and we include all of our space in the space calculation that I was talking about here. So be an interesting question for me to ask Mike Jonan at PEDS. I'm pretty sure that they list all of that space in the admin pavilion as associated with university programs. I know that's probably not a full answer for you. What is A&P?
The AP Pavilion, sorry, this is Melanie. The AP Pavilion, where all of our offices and PRAs are located, is actually children's space. So no, Children's is actually paying all of our F&A, getting none of it back from the university. You know, my RO1 has $800,000 of F&A, and I have no lab space. So basically, all of us that are doing clinical research who don't need wet lab space are subsidizing the wet lab space for other people who do have wet lab space, and we're getting no direct credit or benefit or anything from this and are completely scrambling with other resources, and not getting the benefit of our FNA, not seeing the benefit of our FNA.
You get,
And that's what we've been told. I mean, that's going up to Steve Daniels, going up to GNC. Our FNA is subsidizing lab space for other people.
sure, yeah. But you're getting the designated portion of your ICR return related to your grants, right?
It's minimal. It's like 2%.
Right, tiny. Well, you know, I'll explore that question with Mike Jonan to find out.
That would be
Gannon,
great.
to find out the answer. But yeah, I wouldn't have high hopes that it's going to get fixed. Let me see if I can go back through some of these questions and quickly answer them. I'm sorry, I couldn't figure out how to bring up this chat room. So Melanie, again, I find this aspect incredibly frustrating because we are dependent on grants and contracts to submit on our behalf, and we have had many things go on late or wrong because of grants and contracts, not the PI's suggestions. What are you trying to? What are you?
So you just were saying, you know, X, Y, and Z is the PI's responsibility. The PI's responsibility. The PI's responsibility. Well, we can't do anything. We are doing everything in our ability correctly. We are tracking it down, and things are being turned into the NIH late. My K-23 progress reports, now my closeout report, are being turned in late. I had money given back to the Betcher Foundation. Just a string of errors that are completely beyond my control. And so saying that all of this is the PI's responsibility, and this is where I come back to the indirects, because pediatrics GNC is completely underfunded, completely understaffed. I'm not paying for lab space, so put my indirects and get us more staff in GNC so that they're adequately staffed to do this. But it's just really frustrating to hear as a PI, when we work so hard and we're doing everything that we're supposed to do, we're looking bad in the eyes of the NIH and our granting agencies, and it is through no fault of our own. So I just, you know, was particularly frustrated by that, and there needs to be acknowledgement that this is the responsibility of everybody the whole way around.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, and you know, I think the context in the context of my statements is for you to understand that that's technically your responsibility, and just to make sure that you've kind of protected yourself by either documenting the conversations that you've had with grants and contracts, so that, you know, if it comes back to, you know, if somebody comes back on you and says, hey, you know, this was filed late or whatever, you can turn around and say, you know what, I completed my responsibility, and this is now on the backs of the central office.
So that's super helpful.
It doesn't help. It doesn't help you if a report is filed late and it holds up funding. That'd be something that I would shoot directly up to Amy Gannon and say, hey, you know, I've submitted this timely, and I've followed up with three communications with my grants management specialist at OGC. This report was submitted late, and here's how it's affected me. That's the way I would handle something like that. Okay, Kristen has a long comment here about getting PubMed, getting pubs through MedID is now quite an issue. NIH is now automatically. You guys have probably all seen this.
Tim, the point of that was just to say that, just so people know that, you know, even if you're not the first author and don't have control of the paper, that you have to sometimes rely on other people to do those processes, and it can really hold your grants up, and they may not respond. And, you know, it's just a new thing that we have to make sure that we're keeping control of, and that sometimes it's the journal's fault. And so I've had to go in and show screenshots to the NIH of the fact that I've requested it happening from the journal, and the journal hasn't finished it yet, and things like that. So it's just become a lot bigger step than it used to be.
Yeah, I totally agree, and we deal with that every year when we're doing our progress report, because we're kind of in the same boat. You know, I think we're in alignment, and the point is, be aware that this could be a sticking point dealing with both clinicaltrials.gov and the the manuscript policy, because it can hold things up. Okay, so F&A, let's see what we can say here about it. Most of you probably know this. Typical exempted costs are equipment, like I said, patient care coming from the hospitals. There's some, in the budget justification, I pasted a screenshot from the instructions. There's some comment in there about, do the hospitals have their own, overhead rate, blah, blah, blah. Well, both Children's Hospital and University Hospital have a federal rate that they provide to investigators. And so we go ahead and treat those invoices that are patient care related coming directly from the hospital as exempt patient care costs, and we pay them through that outpatient or inpatient expense account. Subcontract expenses, that you all probably know that the budget that goes to the subcontract is exempted from the university's F&A, with one exception. The first $25,000 of that subcontract, the university charges its F&A to. That's so that they can get reimbursed for their expenses that are involved in setting up the subcontract, creating the purchase order, handling the processing of the invoices and the payment back to the subrecipient. So they're allowed to do it on the first $25,000. The important kicker here is if you've got a multi-year grant, a 3-year grant, 5-year grant, the subcontract is considered as one entity. So if you've got, let's just try to make it easy. Let's just say that you have a $15,000 subcontract to another institution over 5 years. The university will take its full F&A on year 1 of $15,000, and they'll take their full F&A of the first $10,000 on the next year's subcontract, because now you've spent $25,000 on this subcontract that the university has charged its own F&A to, and then all invoices moving forward for the rest of the contract coming through this subcontract are exempt from F&A. So it can just be a twist when you're trying to figure out how to handle this F&A in your application when you're submitting it. The CCTSI subcontracts are all large, so we hit that first $25,000 always within the first couple of months of the first year, and so then all subcontract expenses from here to the rest of the 5-year grant are exempted from F&A. Large renovation projects are exempted, and just recently there's a policy out there that if you've got genomics related supplies and reagents in your project, which can be incredibly expensive. Gal, who runs the genomics lab, has pointed this out for years, that it's not fair that he was having to pay F&A on a $2 million supply order when it's all ordered on one invoice. And so there was one purchase order that went out and one invoice that gets paid, and the institution takes 55% on that. So this started to get realized across the country as genomics has exploded. And now you only have to pay F&A on the first $75,000 of genomics related expenses on your project. I don't know the answer to that question there, is if that's treated like a subcontract where that's for the life of the award. So you spend $75,000 in the first year and all other years are exempt or not. Somebody from Grants and Contracts would know that answer, but I found that interesting, and it might actually come into play with some of the projects that you guys might be involved in. The current rate is 55.5%. The off-campus rate is 26%. Industry-funded clinical trials are, and these are handled on a process that's called modified total direct cost, and that just means that that the 55% is charged on all direct costs except for items that are explicitly exempted. It's important to note that this industry-funded clinical trial rate that the university went to recently is 25% for your whole project, or 28%, sorry, for the whole project. It's called total direct costs. So any project dollar spent gets hit with 28%, whether it's on a piece of equipment for an industry-funded child or patient care that would ordinarily be exempted. And then training grants are often 8%. And then the last thing that you guys are probably familiar with is that foundations have their own policies. And Grants and Contracts typically honors that, as long as the foundation's RFA specifies that their policy is to pay no more than 8% of F&A, then grants and contracts will honor that in most cases, is what my experience is. But I don't have a ton of experience with foundations. Some of you probably have a lot more than I do. So some basic guidelines here. Know who your payroll and fiscal administrators are that can help you out. Know the typical procurement procedures and policies for your unit, and create a simple budget template. Learn how to read some simple financial reports, and we're going to do that right here. So now I'm going to flip over to share some different documents. And so many of you that are going to look at this are going to laugh, because you have much more sophisticated grant budgets and clinical trial budgets than this simple little thing that I created on Wednesday to try to show you. So I know that Kristen and Corey and Christine and many of you have done this in much more sophistication. Just going to try to point out some of the high points, and this is kind of in response to some feedback that I got at a prior session where somebody wanted to hear a little bit more about the process of developing a budget. So I create a budget template similar to this for every grant that we do. Even the CTSA grant, which is a $9 million grant, ultimately kind of looks similar to this. So you start out with your personnel. You as the PI, what % effort do you need to charge to your project? And then who are you going to have as other investigators and other folks that you have to fund? And you start talking about what kind of effort. So at the beginning, this is all kind of a crapshoot. The RFA or the funding announcement says that you can submit a budget up to $200,000 or whatever it is. And so you're trying to put this stuff together to see where it comes out. So you start. You have to have access to people's current salaries, and you can get that from your administrative help in your section. And you need to know what type of position the individual has. Let's see if I can do this here. There's a resource on the OGC website. So if you can navigate yourself to the website at Grants and Contracts, you can get this document that is fringe benefit rates for grant proposals. And it breaks down here for Anschutz faculty greater than 50%. What's the fringe benefit rate that you need to plug into your budget? Less than 50% on Anschutz campus. If you're funding from Denver, you gotta get those. Here's the Anschutz campus breakdown for all of these other staff, university staff, classified staff, postdoc fellows. They've split out a special code, special rate for PRAs. And so you've got to know what classification the folks are that are winding up in the personnel category of your budget, so that you get this calculation correct. You get this information from your admin folks. And I highlighted this because I always wanted to put an example in here of a NIH salary cap. So the NIH posts every year what's the maximum equivalent salary that they will pay on a grant. And on our campus, we've got a lot of highly compensated clinician investigators. And so it's not uncommon to have a co-investigator that's got a salary that's well over the current NIH cap. The current cap is $197,300. Just came out in January, I believe. And so my example here is that this co-investor data scientist has a $235,000 annual salary, but that's kind of tough luck. You've got to put it in your grant at $197,300 for the effort that you're budgeting for, and that's all that you can ask for from NIH. The kicker is that this investigator still has to develop 5% of their time, and so it falls back on the departments or the sections or the divisions that the difference between 5% at 235 and 5% at 197 has to be paid by your department or your division or somebody like that. So the institution picks that up as it's called the NIH salary cap gap. Nothing else special here. It's pretty simple math to follow that across. in this example, I'm just indicating that you're going to justify that you need an analyzer. It's over $500,000, so you classify it as equipment. It's highlighted here just so that you can see that when we do our F&A calculation, you'll see that that's excluded. You're going to ask for travel. And what NIH likes to see is that you break this down into some kind of reasonable calculation so that you can kind of document how did you come up with the amount of dollars that you're asking for. You're going to ask for lab supplies and reagents of $3,000, and you're going to end up justifying this with some detail on the budget justification. You might be breaking these down into specific categories of reagents or glassware or something else that's a common kind of category that you can subdivide this out. So here's my discussion of patient care. What I did was just say, okay, I'm going to have this super simple study. I want to recruit 50 participants. I've got this monstrous screen failure rate, and this is how I think it's going to fall apart over 3 years. And I'm going to try to get all my screening done in year 1. I'll have visit 1 occurring later in year 1 and year 2, and some visit 2s late in year 1, and then all the way through. Kind of that's just kind of super simple. And so then you break down what's the cost. So you know what you're going to want to do at each of these. And so I'm just kind of making up some of this stuff that visit 1 is going to have an H&P and a blood draw for some screening labs. And so just quickly, where do you get this detail? So here's the CTRC core lab detail, and here's what would be CTRC, adult CTRC charges. And so for us, you go to the CCTSI and you go to the CTRC and you get over here to look at pricing. And so the nursing related pricing you can find on this tab. So you'll see in some of that detail, there was a blood draw that I picked. This one right here, which is just a venipuncture. It includes the supplies and the CCRC personnel, and we charge $12.39 for that. There's an H&P in here. I picked this one right here, and that's what we would charge. So that's where I kind of grabbed this detail here. Similarly for the CTRC pricing, we've got it all here, and you can go through and pick it out. And so I know that I had glucose in there, and so I came in here and grabbed this $5.81 charge and added it in here. If you've got other activities like you're doing work at the Brain Imaging Center, you're going to communicate with them to get information about charging. And if there are things going on in your hospitals, there's folks that you can talk to get the charges that are going to be applicable for the work that you're proposing. So then you've got your costs, you've got what you're going to do, you've got your quantity, you extrapolate it all out. In this particular case, the sum here is $5,000. It's also exempted from F&A. And then you've got your participant fees that you're going to pay, and you're going to have some recruitment costs. And so I've just thrown all of that in. So you have a calculation that grabs all of your costs here as your total direct cost for the project. You do your F&A calculation, which is your total direct cost minus any costs that are exempted, and then times the F&A rate. And so that's how I arrived at that number, and I've got a total. I do the same thing for year 2. You could inflate the salaries by 3%. Some mechanisms allow you to do that. Other mechanisms do not allow you to do that. And so, for instance, the CCTSI, we're not allowed to do it. It's got to be flat every year, which is unrealistic. So every year our salaries are going up and we're having to cut back in other non-salary line items. But some mechanisms will allow you to add in the inflation factor for salaries. And so it's basically the same as the prior tab with some changes. Maybe I increased these by 3%. Same calculations. I updated, what's my expected quantities on some of these that are tied to patient visits. The same thing again for year 3. And then what I like to do is I like to pull everything forward as a summary into the first year. That way, when I'm entering this information into the application tool, I can verify that the amounts that are coming up for direct costs at F&A and total costs for the projects are all kind of lining up. I haven't made an error. So that's my grant budget development 101. There are folks on this call that have a lot of experience doing this. I wanted to show just a draft budget justification. Let's see, I'm gonna be able to open it up. Get you out of the way. There we go. Okay, so here's my stab at a draft budget justification. You guys have probably all done this. You start with your personnel. You need to list the name of the personnel, their role, what's their effort to the project. Always needs to be listed in calendar months. And then you provide an explanation for what's this person going to be doing for their effort, and a little bit about why are they qualified to do that. Is typically what you'll see in the justifications for the more key personnel, for sure. Folks that aren't really key personnel, general research coordinators, laboratory technicians, you don't need to get too detailed with kind of qualifications. You just kind of outline what their role and contribution to the project is. So I've just kind of listed some of this stuff here. If you're requesting equipment, you want to say what you're requesting, and you want to put in a good solid justification for why it's required for this project. It's often helpful to add a quote for the equipment to document that you're asking for, that you're requesting the right price. You're not asking for a $10,000 analyzer that you're going to get for $7,500. Travel. Here's my comment about travel. Just state in there what's the purpose of it. Try to break it down into some some simple kind of estimated costs. For supplies, here's the instructions from the SF 424 instructions. They want you to list the total funds requested, and in the budget justification, indicate the general categories such as glassware, chemicals, animal costs, etc., including amount for each category. Categories with amounts that are less than $1,000 are not required to be itemized. So that's a big deal. If you can keep it under $1,000, it saves you a lot of work from going through and itemizing how you came up with the cost. Everything else drops into this other direct cost category, and so you itemize your patient care costs. And this, I've got just some comments here about expensing as outpatient or inpatient charges if they come from the hospital, like I already mentioned. The participant costs, your participant payments, those are just regular costs that are going to get hit with F&A. The CTRC LabCorp costs, any of the other costs on campus that you get from a service corps or anything like that are you're going to get hit with F&A. And then this comment on on IRB costs. If you're using COMERB and you're the primary site, then you can't charge the IRB fees. Please, Kristen or somebody else, correct me if I'm wrong here. If you're part of another study where the parent IRB is at a different site, and you have to submit paperwork to that site for the IRB approval for the work that you're funded to do, I believe you're allowed to include those costs that you have to pay that other IRB as direct costs on your grant. So just kind of think about that in broader terms. And then here I just pasted the screenshot out of the instructions that talk about some of the issues that you would think about in. Here's the discussion about the IRB, and this link will take you to it about what you need to be thinking about when putting certain items into this. So I don't need to belabor that for too much. And so then I wanted to go back quickly because I've got 9 more minutes. After you get your budget, after you get your grant, I highly recommend that you do something like this to reconcile your expenses and track your expenses. You might not need to break it down into every single month. You may be able to break it down and just have here's what my budget was awarded, a column, here's my expenses to date, and a variance column. But this, if you extrapolated it out, you've got a broader, more accurate look. And so in a nutshell, what I'm doing here is saying, here's my awarded budget, and you got to be careful that if your budget got cut, you've kind of done the work to figure out where are you going to place those cuts within your budget. You can't just use your grant application budget because now you've been cut 15%. You got to start with the right dollar amount, and then you start playing out how do you think these expenses are going to unfold over the course of your study. For salaries, it's pretty easy. You're going to take your salary amount and pretty much divide it by 12. I've got this highlighted because every year, except for this year, we get a 3% merit increase. That's not going to happen this year. So you had that budgeted into your grant, you're going to get some money back in that case. And so, what I did was I took the first 2 months at 1/12 of this, and the last at 1/12 plus 3% to reflect the cost of that, the fact that those are actually going to be hitting my grant at that amount. If you knew that you were going to have people come off the grant at a specific point in time, you would want to include that. You'd want to include their expenses up to a certain point and then take them out from there on out. And the delineation of the shaded area in this example is just that I'm pretending that we've made it through November 21. You've reconciled every month of your grant expenditures. So these represent actual expenditures that you can tie back to the finance system, and these are all still projected. These are your best guesses of what's going to happen in the next 5 months. And I just put some things in here just to kind of play around. So you're budgeted 75 for your analyzer. Lo and behold, when you went to buy it in November, you got a little bit of a discount. You got it for 7,200. So you got a little bit of savings there. Your best guess on your salary expenses is that you're going to be almost $2,000 over what you budgeted because of these increases here. Or maybe somebody got an increase across you. Maybe you as the PI got a mid-year salary increase or something. But all of these scenarios can play out in different ways. But this is projecting a $2,000 deficit in salaries. Well, you've made up a little bit here. Your travel came in at $1,300, not $1,475. So this is just a fake example. This was my best guess at your colleagues and your own experience will highlight that your best guesses of how your recruiting timeline is going to go is probably never correct. And so I tried to play around with just different numbers just to illustrate that, hey, I had all this budgeted, but what I was able to recruit and what I was able to convert to visit 1 and what I was able to convert to visit 2 wasn't what I kind of had expected. And so I've had some savings there as well. These savings will be spent in the next year because I've still got to recruit those folks in the next year. And so hopefully you'll be able to carry those over if you've got those funds remaining. Here's how your supplies kind of broke out. You didn't start buying supplies until August, so that's in here. And you bought most of your base supplies, and you don't think that you're going to really need to do anything except for some final experiments in April. So you're projecting your best guess is this is what you're going to spend. You've got some savings here. And you can go down that. And so what this tells you here is that this bottom corner right here is just a snapshot of throughout the course of your project where with your best guesses where you're going to end up at the end. Are you going to have money left over, or are you going to have a deficit that you've got to deal with? And so I just have a comment here that says, use this tool to help you understand how your project is going to progress financially under your best assumptions. You want to know early on if you're projecting a large surplus or if you're projecting a large deficit. You want to know that early on in your project because you're going to have to start talking to people about how to reconcile that. If you're going to have a surplus, you need to know, can I carry that to the next year on this mechanism or not? If not, I need to spend it down. What's the best compliant way to do that? If I'm projecting a large deficit, it's time to start talking about what do I need to change so that I kind of bring this from a large negative to close to 0. So I wanted to get to a financial statement really quick in the last 4 minutes. I don't know how it works in your research units, whether you have administrative support that does this stuff for you, or whether they just give you reports and expect that you kind of read them. This is called a financial detail report. It has all of the detail for a specific period of time that you run the report. I ran this report from March through June. This is a real project. It was a novel methods project to a gentleman from a couple of years ago. So always the first line is revenue. On your grants, this represents that grants and contracts is billed for expenses that you've incurred and they've gotten paid. You can totally disregard that. It's not your responsibility to track that down. First section is always people. And I say to you, look at it at the high level first. Make sure that you understand the names that you're seeing here. It's not uncommon for mistakes to occur and somebody else's salary is getting charged to your grant because somebody put in the wrong number. So just make sure that it's in the right, that it's the right name, and generally convince yourself when you do your reconciliation that it's generally in the right amount of money that you're expecting. I'm highlighting this because depending upon the different classifications of personnel, you could have 4 or 5 different categories of personnel type here, but ultimately they all subtotal to a total amount of actual expenses for the reporting period. And then what follows is a whole bunch of benefit calculations that you can pretty much ignore. Go to the bottom line and you get the monthly total or the report period total, and then you can tie that back over to your tracking budget by, just say we're looking at May. Your total of salary and benefits in May is whatever that totals up to. Does it match what you're expected within reason? If not, you got to start talking to people about why or trying to investigate why. And then that breaks down into all of the individual costs for supplies and services that you purchase. You should be glancing through this to make sure that you're understanding, yep. My lab tech ordered all of those things, and those are things I expect to see on my project. And then in our reports, there's no travel on this, but travel is listed as a separate category here at the bottom, just above F&A. And again, it's important to recognize the name of the people who are posting travel expenses. The name is always provided. That way you can, track down an error if somebody accidentally charged their travel to your grant. And then, here's what I was saying about F&A. You can see I collapsed these cells here. It goes from 343 to 448. It's just a litany of detail of how the university charged F&A. I don't even deal with that at all. I go straight to the bottom line and say, okay, how much total F&A was charged in this reporting period. So that's the anatomy of a general financial report. That you would use that data to kind of go back over to whatever spreadsheet you're using to track the financial progress of your grant. I'm at 10 o'clock. I'm happy to entertain any questions. If people want to just drop off, that's fine. What would you like me to do? Would you like me to try to go through the chat room here and see if there's ones that we want to talk about?
Sure.
Okay. See, I think we left off with Kristen's comment. And then Natalie had a comment about clinicaltrials.gov. Still confused what needs to be in clinical for human subjects research. So that's an answer I'm just not detailed. I don't deal with it other than on the compliance side. But further up in this chat room, I believe that Corey or somebody gave a contact for somebody at Grants and Contracts that would be able to help with that. We talked about Melanie's space. Corey, knowing that NIH is likely to cut the budget that was initially proposed, it is recommended to inflate the budget by some margin, and I totally agree with that, Corey. We should be inflating it, within reason. Something that a reasonable person reviewing your grant would say, yeah, that's the way to go. We also put on our website that CTRC expenses our fees go up 6% a year. We don't always charge that, especially on investigator-initiated fee structures, but we always do it on the clinical, the CTO side, the industry-initiated studies. We inflate those rates by 6% every year. That's what the hospital does as well. But I totally agree with Corey's comment there, because you'll need to find some savings somewhere. Kristen, again, one nice thing about the budget justification, there's no page limit. So you're right, you can elaborate to convince folks that you thought about what you're requesting. And it's important that if you've put something in the budget justification and it gets awarded, then when an auditor comes back and questions, or somebody in grants and contracts questions, if you can point to that justification that this was in my application, this was approved, there's no comments in my notice of grant award to the contrary, I'm interpreting this as that it's an allowable expense on my grant. And just a comment at the end that she's dropping off. Okay, so unless anybody wants to bring up a topic for general grants management conversation that I may or may not be able to contribute to, or one of your colleagues can, then I would say thanks for the opportunity to present to you today. I hope you found it useful. Substantive comments in that evaluation form won't hurt my feeling. Things that are elaborated on for too much or weren't useful, I'd love to be able to take those out and provide content that you would find more useful.
Thank you so much, Tim.
Tim, this is Corey. I have a real quick question about the financial report that you're showing here. How do you, I've never seen a report with this level of detail. Is this something that administrative folks in our divisions can produce for us?
Yeah, absolutely. If you want to see this level of detail, it literally takes seconds to run and output as either a PDF or an Excel document. So, like Christine Landry could do it, or anybody else under her that has finance access can run these reports for your project.
Tim, is there
oh, sorry, Kristen. I was just gonna say, I like this financial detail report. It can be overwhelming because these things can sometimes be thousands of lines long, especially with lots of personnel detail. But if you get it in an Excel spreadsheet, you can kind of mix and match and filter. But it gives you every charge that hit your grant.
I was just wondering, what it was called exactly so that we can ask for it. So financial detail report, that's what you would refer to this as?
It's called an MFIN. That's the type of financial report in the system, an MFIN financial detail report. And you can ask how to get access to that, or an equivalent report that PEDS or somebody might want to provide. But I find it the most.
We get this from Peggy every month. So you just have to ask. But yeah, we get this from Peggy every month on every single one of our grants when we review all of our grants with her.
Yeah, I find it helpful, and putting some of this practice into place about figuring out what works best for you. I mean, oftentimes I won't spend the time personally in the first couple of months of a project to go through the detail, but at some point after the first quarter or maybe 4 months, I'll definitely sit down with this detail and go into my equivalent of financial tracking and make sure that I'm indicating what actual expenses hit my project. And it's useful because you can often use what your actual experience might fine-tune your assumptions that you've put into spending for some later months. Maybe you assumed that you were going to be spending more, but based upon what you've spent in the first several months, you're realizing, I'm not going to actually end up using all of that money. I can tone down some of these assumptions in the later months in this budget category and generate some savings that I can cover some salary over expenditures or something like that. So I do find it helpful, whatever kind of modified format you develop that works best for you. This practice is really important. Well, if anybody doesn't have any more burning comments, then we can call it a day.
Thank you so much, Tim. Your wealth of knowledge.
Well, thank you. And I'm always willing to learn from others. So if you find things that I said that were inconsistent with your knowledge, then point them out to me. And Melanie, I'm going to ask Mike Jonan about the F&A piece that you talked about.
Yeah, that would be great. There's a ton of us in children's that don't have any wet lab space. So if we could move that money over to getting more folks and grants and contracts to help poor Peggy out, that would be awesome.
Yeah. Okay, I'll reach out to him just so that I can understand the situation. If I learn anything substantive, I'll definitely communicate with you. If you don't hear from me, it means that
It's what we heard, yeah.
Yeah, that they've already heard about it, then they've solved it the only way they know how.
Perfect. Thank you, appreciate it.
All right, everybody. Nan, this thing is being recorded. Oh, let me stop sharing my screen. This thing is being recorded, so should I just stop it now? And then I've never done this before. What do I do with this recording?
If you could just send the link to me, you should receive a link. Do you know how to
Okay.
do that?
All right, well, let's see. I'm going to